Hello, I'm Darkwell, Bled, and welcome back to Beyond the Rusted Gate. Today's short story is set in my home state of South Australia and holds the achievement of being the only story my mother says made her feel physically unwell. And so with no further ado, the Mangroves. The mangroves of St Kilda are a vast tangle of low canopies, twisted roots and branches, saltwater puddles and ponds, and occasional dry salt shelves. Once a popular tourist location, the Grove's boardwalk has long since fallen into disarray and disrepair. In 2015, this state of dilapidation saw a metal gate erected, closing off more than half the boardwalk to the public. This gate included a sign that stated, "Closed due to maintenance." However, by 2030, this closure had begun to appear indefinite. In addition to this first sign and gate, another was eventually erected at the boardwalk's entrance. This second sign, however, did not speak of maintenance, but instead warned of prosecution for trespassing under the Summary Offences Act of 1953. Despite this, the boardwalk and its tangled groves were still frequented, albeit illegally, by a new crowd. This group consisted mainly of urban explorers, schoolboys looking for a thrill, and teenagers hoping for a private place to drink and together be alone. Because of the illegal nature of these adventures, the mangroves were now almost exclusively visited under the security of night's darkness, and it was within this veil of secrecy that rumors were fostered and spread. From these forays there were, as the local newspaper would eventually put it, whispers of things that go bump in the night. Sensationalist as talks of Bigfoots, monsters and aliens was, none could deny that since the boardwalk's closure, a surprising number of tall stories had come out of the dark forest. These tales were never verified, and their sources, unwilling to put themselves at risk of a fine, were never named. In the long tradition of urban mysteries, most of these accounts were said to have happened to a friend of a friend, though those willing to claim them as their own in social settings would fervently hold to the story's sincerity. Eventually, these stories reached a level of notoriety that warranted the police to comment. They laughed at the idea of monsters and pointed out that South Australia was far too far from North America for Bigfoot to have travelled. The alien lights, they suggested, were nothing more than the fires of those who were regrettably choosing to camp illegally. Mostly, the police simply laughed off the claims and warned against trespassing. However, their acknowledging the stories at all proved to do more damage than good. The next morning's local paper reported the response with a front-page headline that stated, "Police address concern over mangroves, aliens and monsters," which immediately caused the rumour mill to reach new levels. It was this headline that also finally inspired Duncan, Paul and Maria, who had been following the rumours from the mangroves for over a year, to jump the rusted fence, disregard the unevenly hanging sign, and begin down the rotted wooden platforms of the St Kilda Mangrove Trail's boardwalk. "What do you reckon they are?" asked Maria, taking in the amber evening sunlight that shone through the low-hanging canopy over the boardwalk. The boards beneath her were rotted and gave noticeably under her footfall despite her petite build. "Birds," replied Duncan simply, eliciting an annoyed explosion of air from Maria's nostrils. Maria was a true believer in the supernatural. She was, she proudly claimed, a real moulder, and I want to believe poster hanging in her bedroom office and all. Duncan was not. "Come on, Dunk! There have been 3 weird occurrences this month, and that's just the ones we've heard about. How can you say it's just birds?" Duncan laughed and took her hand. The small silver ring she wore was cold but quickly warmed to his touch. Maria and he had been dating for 2 years now and engaged for 1, and this kind of passionate uproar was exactly what he had hoped to elicit with his comment. He took immeasurable pleasure in stirring her up, but just a little. "Monsters," he finally agreed. "Monsters, ghosts, goblins, werewolves, mummies, vampires," he elaborated. "And lions and tigers and bears, oh my," Paul added from behind. Paul had crouched down to take a cinematic photo of them walking along the path's wooden boards. Each plank appeared to be perpetually damp despite the dry, warm evening, and some showed the blackness of rot through them. A few had begun to break away entirely, and almost all of them were peppered with small divots of unclear origin, as though someone had been walking the trail while wearing soccer cleats. His camera clicked loudly, and on its display screen Paul could see that he had managed to snap a good action shot of his 2 friends in mid-step. The 3 of them had been going on their ghost adventures since long before Maria and Duncan had begun dating, and Paul remained the comfortable third wheel to all their non-romantic outings. Maria was the team's enthusiast and researcher, and the only true believer amongst them. She had founded the group back when they were all still in high school. Her room looked as though it was the office of a detective in a mystery film, with sticky notes covering the walls and pins of different colors marking spots on local maps denoting sightings of various creatures. She had read every book and article on local hauntings and had penned several blogs on the matter herself to a small but enthusiastic following. Paul was the documentarian and photographer of the group. He had yet to see or photograph any ghosts or monsters, but he had captured a whole lot of pretty scenery and interesting buildings, and so he was content. He had no strong belief in ghosts, neither positive nor negative, but often answered, "There were no white swans until there were," when he was pressed on the matter. Duncan was just there for the ride and the company more than anything else. He was an unabashed cynic who did not believe in ghosts, spirituality, magic, or religion, but enjoyed their adventures and the atmosphere of their outings all the same. "Don't fall too far behind, Paul, it's getting dark real fast," advised Maria, quickly glancing down at her wristwatch. She had had the watch since she was 11, and on its face a cartoon Scooby-Doo was pointing one arm at the 7 and the other at the 12. Paul laughed. "It's getting dark fast, so don't walk too far ahead," he called back in response. Maria and Duncan had walked about 20 meters along the board, talking offhandedly about various rumors Maria had collected in regards to the location, when suddenly a loud click and a bright flash lit up behind them, signifying that it was officially dark enough to warrant Paul to begin using his camera's flash. "Caught any of the universal monsters yet, Paul?" gestured Duncan. "Just the Invisible Man, but I can imagine the Gill Man might be around these parts," he responded dryly. The sun hung close to the horizon, but with the thick canopy of mangroves surrounding them, darkness was encroaching far more quickly than the sun was setting. Fearing that they would soon find themselves in total blackness, the trio decided it was time to establish their camp. They were not exactly spoiled for choice. With the tide having come in, many of the flat areas that would have been dry when their walk began had already flooded or soon would. A quick look around gave them only two strong options: a small mound of salt shelving slightly off their path, and a two-benched gazebo that the boardwalk cut through the middle of. Both the salt shelf and the gazebo had their positives and negatives, not the least of which was the risk of foot wetting presented by the encroaching tide. However, with the heavy presence of mosquitoes and the unsealable nature of the gazebo structure, it was decided that the group, in violation of the posted signage requesting visitors not to leave the boardwalk, would step off the path and establish their tent roughly 15 meters away from the trail. Their tent, once built, stood in a location almost entirely encased in the twisted knots and branches of the surrounding groves. "Are you sure this area won't get wet?" Paul asked as he took a snap of their small camp. "If it isn't wet now, I think it will remain okay," Maria replied. The trio planned to take full advantage of their long weekend and stay until Monday evening. Because the sightings were all reported as having happened at night, it was intended that they would sleep through the day, their tent shaded by the groves, and then explore all night. However, before they set out on their first night's adventure, it was decided that dinner should first be had and bug spray should be liberally applied. "Just one of these is more than your daily recommended salt intake," Duncan read with dramatic false concern from the back of his packet of 2-minute noodles. "Full of salt, surrounded by salt, sleeping on salt. When in Rome, etc., 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 replied Maria as she poured the last of the Pringles from the tube into her mouth. "See the mangroves, be the mangroves," added Paul, who was intermittently eating Doritos while looking through his photos. "Any mysterious shapes in those?" asked Maria with true hopefulness. "No, they're all triangles," responded Paul. "I meant in the photos, not the Doritos," said Maria. "Oh, well, no. What shapes are you expecting to see?" he responded without looking up. "Pygmies," she said, drawing Paul's attention and now stopping his scrolling. "Pygmies," repeated Paul in disbelief. "In South Australia," he continued, not phrasing it as a question. "Isn't that term derogatory?" asked Duncan. Maria reddened. "It is the proper anthropological term," she replied with exasperation, before adding with hesitation, "I looked it up before we left. This boardwalk was made in 1984. Don't you think a supposed tribe of people would have been seen when or since they built it? They have been seen. 2 of the weird occurrences reported this month spoke of little people running around the mangroves. And there is an aboriginal myth of small people, red devils, that were here, they say, even before the indigenous people were." "Well, if pygmy isn't offensive, I'm certain little people or red devils is," replied Duncan. "Oh, be quiet," replied Maria with a laugh, throwing her empty Pringles tube in his direction. "I'm just saying, dear, in this modern political climate—" "Shh! she said, now whispering. You wouldn't want to, Duncan began again before Maria once more cut him off mid-sentence. No, really, shut up. Listen, she hissed. The trio fell silent, and somewhere in the distance a soft sound like nails being driven into rotted wood could be heard plodding along the boardwalk. Maria's breath caught, lines of concern ran across Duncan's face, and Paul cut the power of their small travel lamp, plunging the tent into darkness. The plods continued, grew in number, and were soon accompanied by the splash of water and the crunch of sand. Some kind of animals? Paul whispered in suggestion. Whatever it is, there are a lot of them, Maria whispered fearfully. She had seen one too many adventure films set in the exotic and largely fanciful Africa of Hollywood, and between them and the theory she had just postulated, it was all too easy to imagine that they were surrounded on all sides by a savage tribe of minuscule, mask-wearing, spear-wielding cannibals. Whatever they are, I don't care, so long as they're not parkland security, hissed Duncan. Behind them, somewhere in the darkness, branches broke and crunched with sudden closeness. Maria screamed, a powerful odor filled the tent, and Duncan burst out laughing. The travel lamp flickered on, and Duncan struggled with the tent's zipper before stumbling outside, gasping. I don't care how many monsters there are out there. I need fresh air, he yelled. Dunk, don't, Maria called after him, to which Duncan replied, I have to. Don't worry, there's nothing out here. Your fart scared them away. Maria joined him on the outside, pouting. Girls don't fart, she said with faked indignation. See? Nothing here, Duncan repeated. Paul joined them on the outside, glancing around, then snapped a shot of the mangled branches behind their tent. Nothing's here now, but something was, he concluded. Their following investigation confirmed this. In addition to the broken branches, they could see that small cone-like divots had been pushed into the sand, forming a trail that returned to the boardwalk and joined the hundreds of similar punctures in the wood that Paul had previously observed. The dents, both in the sand and the wood, were photographed by Paul, and a vote was put forward as to what their next step should be. Well, we go home or we push on. It's as simple as that, Duncan laid out. We can't go back. This is something. For once, something, Maria voted, not allowing her initial scare to deter her. I agree. After years of us doing this is some kind of tangible lead, and even if it is just a herd of nocturnal possums, I'd like to know, Duncan stated, turning to Paul for his vote. All possums are nocturnal, Paul replied, adding, well, it will be nice to have something to actually photograph for once. It was decided, and so the trio glanced up and down the boardwalk and the trail of pinpricks going off in both directions. Which way? Duncan asked after a pause. Deeper, Maria responded. The boardwalk is a full loop. We'll have to jump another fence to do the loop, but at least if we go deeper we won't backtrack and we won't miss anything, she suggested. Deeper, Paul responded, flicking on his flashlight. Good, he added with false enthusiasm. Maria and Duncan activated their flashlights in turn, and all three of them began to plod along the path. They walked in silence, jumping at every shadow, and pointed their lights at every sound the wind made through the darkened canopy above. The moon was only half full and the night cloudy. In the blackness they walked with quiet caution. The boardwalk on which they slowly progressed only ran 1.7 kilometers through the thick groves, but to walk the full circumference around the twisted trees would be to journey 44 kilometers. Within the 1,219 hectares of thick forest in which they now found themselves, it was easy enough to imagine that somewhere an entire lost civilization of undiscovered pygmies could exist. Maria was thinking that actually discovering a lost tribe, or even more unbelievably, an actual cryptid, would make her a household name. Duncan was thinking that perhaps he had been a little too early to cynicism, and that maybe, just maybe, he was a little scared. And Paul was thinking that he had to take a shit. I have to take a shit, Paul said. Really? Maria responded, annoyed by the potential delay. Yeah, I've gotta, he confirmed. Duncan threw him a roll of toilet paper from his backpack as Paul stepped off the boardwalk into the trees. May the bear spirit protect your call to nature, Duncan called after him in a poor imitation of a Native American accent. Don't go too far, Maria cautioned. But don't stay too close, Duncan requested. Maria fidgeted with her silver ring with impatient anxiety. What if we actually find a something, she asked. Well, then Paul photographs it, said Duncan simply. And if they're dangerous, she prompted. Well, then Paul photographs it and we run, returned Duncan. As they conversed, the scent of fresh air and sea salt was once more drowned out by the unnatural odor that they had suffered in the tent. I guess I owe you an apology. Smells like Paul was the perpetrator of that chemical attack earlier, said Duncan. "I'll look for your attraction in tomorrow's paper," replied Maria. Before Duncan could mount a witty retort of his own, a loud crack broke from the trees and Paul shrieked, then went silent. Maria and Duncan ran towards the noise. Upon arrival at the location of the shriek, Duncan vomited at the odor's revolting explanation, and Maria paled. Paul was gone. In his place was nothing but broken branches, his camera, and a severed arm. Duncan, in hysterics, stood dry-heaving against a thick branch. After a moment, Maria regained her composure somewhat, but was still unsteady on her feet. "It's not his," she concluded. That was for damn sure. The arm was rotten and had clearly been in a state of decay for days or possibly weeks. It was apparent that it was a contributing factor to the foul smell, but by no means made up the whole of it. "That's an arm," Duncan reported loudly, shakily pointing towards it. "Yes," Maria replied, snapping a shot of it with Paul's abandoned camera before crouching near the limb to take another photo from a lower angle. It wasn't just part of an arm, but a whole arm, all the way up to the shoulder joint. Maria noted with a fascination for detail that made Duncan feel all the more unwell that the arm appeared to have been chewed off rather than cut, as the flesh around the shoulder joint was torn and uneven. She then inspected it from another position and found something further that was unusual about it. "The end of this arm is hollowed out, like something dug around in it or was jammed into it," she reported, and Duncan vomited again. They walked further into the darkness of the tangled mangroves and away from the footpath. Had they still the option to recast their vote, they would have both opted to turn back and go home. With Paul now missing, that was, however, no longer an option. The flashlights gave them little visibility amongst the claustrophobic branches, and the moon had entirely given up on them. They splashed through shallow ponds and tripped on winding roots, inadvertently but unavoidably announcing their presence to anyone who cared to know of it. Maria and Duncan felt sure that there were those out there who did care to know it, and they could feel the eyes of these strange predators watching them and stalking just beyond sight. "Paul would never leave his camera," stated Maria. "Paul would also never disappear mid-shit into the forest in the middle of the night," replied Duncan. "That isn't funny," Maria criticized. "It wasn't a joke," replied Duncan weakly. They had been wandering for half an hour when Duncan's flashlight flickered and went dark. What followed happened with a speed that attested to how closely and patiently their stalkers were watching them. Maria's torch smashed, knocked out of her hand by an unseen projectile. She screamed and Paul's camera, which she had still been holding, went off, its flash momentarily stunning Duncan. Burned into his retina by the flash, though quickly fading, was the dark strobe-captured image of dozens of small creatures. They were chest-high figures of strange obscurity. Duncan blinked rapidly as the short monsters slowly faded as his sight was restored back to normality. The odor returned, Maria shrieked and yelled again, and Duncan was knocked to the ground, hitting his head and losing consciousness. Duncan could not be certain upon awakening exactly how long he had been unconscious, though the lingering odor convinced him that it had been at most minutes. Maria was gone and the flashlights were scattered and broken. Feeling around the forest floor, Duncan soon found Paul's camera, and using its flash as a light source, he managed to eventually stumble and tumble his way back to the boardwalk. Where he arrived was not the spot from which they had left the path, so he looked around to familiarize himself with his surroundings. In one direction the path continued as it had been. This was, he thought, where they had come from. In the other direction stood one of the boardwalk's observation posts rising up above the groves. Figuring that this was his best option for finding his friends, Duncan moved quickly towards the observation post, climbed the wooden ladder that led up to the treehouse-like platform, and began to scan the horizon. From this vantage point it would be, Duncan lamented, in actuality very difficult to see his friends, who were no doubt obscured by the thick canopy. It would, he was sure, be even harder to see the small creatures that the camera's flash had briefly burned into his vision. Duncan paused in thought. It was the flash of the camera that had burned the image of the creatures momentarily into his eyes. Had the camera in doing so managed to capture an image of them? Duncan brought up the camera's display screen. The camera was on low battery, following his use of the flash as a light source, and so, not wanting to waste any further power, he pulled up the latest photos hastily. Duncan looked at the screen, and a small demonic creature, captured in perfect HD, looked back at him. "Whoa! Paul and Maria will be wrapped with this photo," he said, before realizing the irony of his statement. His best friend and his fiancée were lost somewhere in the forest, likely taken by these strange creatures, and Duncan fully intended to find them. He looked down again at the image. There were 3 of them photographed, one staring directly at the camera and 2 caught mid-stride. The creatures, aside from their bipedal nature, did not appear to be human in any real sense, nor were they the red devils of Aboriginal legend, or at least not insofar as that name referred to the creature's colour. Rather than red, the 3 small monsters in the photograph were of the same hue as the salt plains that had birthed the mangroves and perhaps had birthed these creatures too. They stood, from what Duncan could tell by the photo, no higher than 4 feet tall. However, stand may be too loose a use of the word to describe what these creatures did. Balance was perhaps more accurate, as these demons were footless. While their thighs and knees looked as they should, beyond the knee joints the creature's anatomy took a horrific turn. Their legs ended in sharp spikes that ran from the shins and tapered into narrow points ending where their ankles should begin. These points appeared to sink deep into the sand, apparently leaving the dents and holes that Duncan and his friends had earlier observed. In addition to the leg spikes, the creatures were similarly without hands, with spikes tapering from their forearms towards the place where their wrists should start. Their eyes were deep, sunken, and black, and their teeth were seemingly filed sharp and of similar darkness. Were it not for their strange limbs, their faces alone would inspire terror, but as a whole they were, as a collective, dread itself. Duncan, despite his years of dating Maria, had never heard described anything to match creatures such as these. The image of them raised more questions than answers, and Duncan began to ponder their strangeness to himself. He wondered whether or not their sharp limbs were from a deformity, or if they were natural or a cosmetic cultural modification like foot binding. And what of the severed limb that they had found when Paul had gone missing? Was it one that one of the creatures had lost through leprosy or some such similar disease? Was that why their arms looked the way they did? This seemed unlikely. The 3 creatures caught in the image had spikes tapering from their forearms towards their wrist, whereas the severed arm was detached high up at the shoulder. In that case, he wondered, had they brought the severed arm with them? Or perhaps it was unrelated. Had Paul simply screamed at seeing the arm, and was it that noise which had attracted them? This didn't seem likely to Duncan either. Paul was never squeamish, although it was true Duncan had never seen him exposed to something quite so gory. But if the arm hadn't already been there, then why would the creatures bring it with them? This question scared Duncan the most. Perhaps the creatures carrying a severed arm indicated that they were cannibalistic, though it did seem strange to him that they would bring with them something such as an arm on a what? A quest? A hunt? Maybe the arm was meant as a club, Duncan thought, but that didn't explain why, as Maria had noted, the end of it had been hollowed out. Nor did it explain how creatures with no fingers could use a club or even carry one, or carry his friends off for that matter. At the very least, what was clear to Duncan was that the creatures were evidently hostile, and that, whatever their intentions towards his friends were, he must find Maria and Paul as fast as he could. However, in an area as vast as the Mangroves, what was far less clear to Duncan was exactly how he should go about doing such a thing. It was only at this ponderous impasse that Duncan's thoughts cleared enough to allow him to hear his surroundings. Somewhere below in the distance and moving away from him were the crashing sounds that had twice earlier signified destruction and odor. Duncan quickly turned off the camera to conserve its battery, and standing upon the lookout cast his eyes out across the forest. He scanned the tangled branches of the groves, at first seeing nothing, but was drawn to a stop by strange movements in the distance. There were, pushing and breaking through branches, 3 lumbering figures of unusual height and disjointed movements. Their arms and legs seemed to bend in more joints than was natural. In stark contrast to the little demons he had witnessed earlier, these creatures appeared to stand perhaps 7 feet tall, and, with extraordinarily long, low-hanging arms, they walked with a strange, jolting lumber. They appeared to be moving towards an orange glow in the distance that could only just be made out through the trees, and Duncan immediately marked their destination as his own. These creatures were, Duncan reasoned, surely connected in some form with the smaller ones. After all, what were the chances of 2 unknown monsters existing within the same forest? Further, much as they were crashing through the mangroves now, similar crashing had been heard in relation to when both Paul and later Maria had gone missing. What's more, these creatures were possibly an explanation for how his friends had actually been taken, as, while he couldn't imagine the smaller, handless creatures managing to carry a person, he could certainly imagine one of these tall ones achieving it. These larger creatures were perhaps subservient to the smaller ones, Duncan reasoned, or perhaps vice versa. At the very least, it seemed they shared some form of symbiotic relationship with one another, as there had been evidence of both of them at each of the encounters they had had. Despite these larger creatures' long legs and despite his running through near-pitch blackness, the tall monsters lumbered with a slowness that allowed for Duncan to gain on them in short order. Soon he found they had reached their destination, and so he stopped too. Reactivating the camera, Duncan observed them through its zoom from a distance. From his presumed safety and obscured by trees, Duncan looked in on the strange village, and any doubt that these giants were connected to his small attackers or his missing friends were immediately eroded. The two tribes were clearly one and the same, with the three large creatures he had observed from afar standing amongst the smaller ones. They all appeared as dark, ill-defined shapes in the night, lit only by a small flickering fire in the center of their encampment. He could not see his friends, and this worried him immensely because the creatures moved with excitement and there was nowhere else he could imagine his friends to be. Beyond that, even with the camera's zoom, any further details were impossible to make out. They were too far away and it was too dark. Hoping to approach further, Duncan switched off the camera again, only to immediately realize he was no longer alone. It was the smell that did it. That odious stench of rank and rot that 3 times earlier had alerted him to the presence of these large creatures. Before Duncan had even had a chance to move, he felt a cold hand close itself over his throat and stifle his yelp. It closed, and he could feel that the hand was dirty, bloodied, and ice-cold. He kicked and writhed to get loose, but for his efforts was thrown hard against a nearby root which thudded softly with indifference. Once more, he was rendered unconscious. Duncan awoke and was immediately reminded of his position by searing pain and the stench of rotting flesh. A sharp-toothed creature, one of the minuscule ones, was biting and tearing at Duncan's upper thigh. He kicked at the creature with his free foot until it scampered away, only to be replaced immediately by 2 more. They ripped away at his flesh, tearing his skin to threads that hung loose and bloodied, and in a strange moment Duncan found himself noting that they comically resembled the rubber of a burst balloon. At this range he could see the creatures in even clearer detail. The sharp endings of their limbs were exposed bones spiked to a point. Whether natural or not, Duncan could not tell, nor at this point did he much care. At the section in which the bone connected back to flesh, their skin was fused directly to it, and clear stems of exposed nerves hung freely from their joints. Duncan tried to convince himself that there were no clear signs of his friends in the encampment. He reassured himself as best he could that the blood stains on the salt shelf and the 2 skulls and torsos burning in the flames of the small campfire could belong to anyone. The person who had earlier lost an arm, perhaps. Duncan kicked and screamed and thrashed as more of the small creatures piled onto him. A few used their spiked limbs to pin him down through impalement. They tore at his upper thigh and bit into his shoulders at the joints. He was losing a lot of blood and his vision was blurring, and he was growing tired, just so tired. Defeated and utterly exhausted, Duncan turned his head to the side and tried to think of anything but his own cannibalization. Nearby he saw one of the giants, and an explanation for their absurd size and strange disjointed movements became clear. These creatures, the large and the small, were definitely one and the same. He could, in horror, just make out the shine of Maria's silver ring on the creature's hand and her silver watch on its wrist. That explains why there are only skulls and torsos in the fire, an unacknowledged voice noted somewhere deep inside Duncan's mind. Her hands, her arms, her legs, now the creatures. The towering monster of dead flesh that wore Maria's arms and legs had, until recently, been one of the smaller creatures. Where its arm and leg spikes should have been, Maria's arms and legs began, explaining the creature's extreme height, their long limbs, and their unnatural additional joints. It shifted its weight and lumbered across the encampment in a strange jumble of movements, still unaccustomed to its newly obtained limbs. Duncan felt his own leg torn free at the thigh, and moments before the pain took him permanently into the darkness, he saw one of the small demons jam its leg spike into his severed limb and deftly wriggle its toes to familiarize itself with its new extension. Thanks for listening. That was the Mangroves, which is within my second collection of short stories, Screams from Beyond the Crypt, which is available in paperback form from most online book distributors. When I first wrote that story in 2020, the Mangroves had been closed since 2015, and I kind of set the story in 2030 as a bit of a dig at the council because it had been taking them so long to open up the mangroves again. But looking at their website now, it's still closed 5 years later, so maybe my prediction of it still being closed in 2030 was more prophetic than I had actually intended it to be. Either way, if it does ever open again and you find yourself in South Australia, you should check it out. It's a great little boardwalk, or at least it was when it was walkable. Regardless, thanks for listening. Tune in next fortnight for a special Christmas episode. And until next time, I have been and still am Darkwell Bled.